Happy New Year, internet friends! I've really enjoyed seeing people's roundups of the best books they read in 2024, and I thought I would belatedly share some of mine. I'm going to highlight 7 titles in this video, 3 fiction, 3 nonfiction, and 1 memoir that is rather controversial. Also, if you're interested, I've started a free Substack newsletter. I'm planning to use this newsletter to talk about topics that I don't always have time to make videos about, such as additional reading recommendations and more detailed hiking trip reports. My very first post is a list of all the books that I enjoyed in 2024, and if you'd like to check that out, the link is on my YouTube profile page. Also, if you read any great books in 2024, let me know down in the comments. So let's get into the top books I've read in 2024. I thought I'd start with nonfiction since I haven't really talked about that a lot yet on this channel, although I do enjoy reading nonfiction and I want to read a lot more of it in 2025. The first one is River of the Gods by Candice Millard. This follows the story of 2 19th century British explorers who were racing against each other to find the source of the Nile River. It was really fascinating to read about their grueling expeditions, and the book was so well researched and well written that it felt like reading an adventure novel. Millard did an amazing job examining each explorer's character and background and how that motivated their actions. There are also lots of juicy details about the rivalry between the 2 explorers. You know how enemies to lovers is a popular trope in fiction right now? What about friends to enemies? That's the one that's really interesting to me. How did 2 BFFs go from close companions to mortal enemies? What exactly happened here? Who's the backstabber? I would love to see a lot more friends to enemies in books. Anyway, that was one of the things that I found really interesting about this story was that the 2 explorers actually started out as collaborators, and then they went on an expedition together and things went wrong and they became enemies for the rest of their lives. While the book does spend a lot of time talking about the British explorers, Millard also includes crucial explanations of the larger backdrop of colonialism and the slave trade that was devastating communities in Africa at the time. She writes about the hundreds of locals who were hired as staff for the expeditions. They worked as porters, translators, and guides, and without them, the expeditions would have failed immediately. She also shares the story of a formerly enslaved man who was so key to the planning and implementation of multiple expeditions that he should have been credited as one of the leaders. I really appreciated that Millard brings these stories to light. The next nonfiction title that I loved was The Other Significant Others by Raina Cohen. This book talks about how current American social norms prioritize the relationship of marriage between 2 people, especially heterosexual couples, to the extent that almost all other relationships are overlooked, meaning that not only are they not really recognized in popular culture, but also that it's seen as weird if you do choose to center one of these relationships in your life. For instance, what if you have a really close best friend, and you decide that maintaining this friendship is a priority in your life? So, for example, you wouldn't accept a job that would mean having to move away from this friend. That would be seen as totally normal if it's a choice you make because of your spouse. But if you make that choice because you want to live near a friend, it's interpreted as maybe being a bit too codependent or immature or not career-focused enough. And that's perhaps a little sad given how many studies are coming out about how disconnected and lonely Americans are. Cohen wanted to explore the untold perspectives of people who have structured their life around a relationship outside marriage against all the social pressure not to. Each chapter profiles a different story. Cohen writes movingly about how we can understand our lives as more than just the sum of our romantic relationships. If you do have a central romantic relationship, it's great, but it doesn't have to be the only metric by which we measure meaning. Here's one of my favorite quotes. To get past the idea that a long-term romantic relationship is the fulcrum of a full life, it helps to recognize a larger truth. As Kiran Setia, a philosophy professor at MIT, writes in his book Life is Hard, when something has value, that doesn't mean we should or must engage with it. And that's the end of that quote. We cannot simultaneously spend our days scuba diving in Costa Rica, live next door to our nieces and nephews in Tennessee, become a performer of Beyoncé-level acclaim, and be a groundbreaking mathematician. All are worthwhile pursuits, but the absence of any of them doesn't lessen life's richness. While we can acknowledge that for plenty of people a romantic relationship is meaningful, it doesn't follow that a life without this type of relationship is, by definition, deficient. There is an abundance of ways to live well. Next up, I have The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. When it was published in the 1960s, this book became a key inspiration for second-wave feminism. Friedan identified a problem that was widespread but unnamed: the malaise experienced by white, mostly suburban women who were told their purpose was to be a housewife and nothing else. She documented how these women often felt frustrated and unsatisfied with their lives. It's important to note that this book, and the ideas that have descended from it, are often misrepresented by current critics of feminism. Friedan is not saying that women shouldn't get married, have children, or enjoy certain aspects of taking care of their homes. She is only pointing out that the idea that these domestic activities are a woman's greatest and indeed only purpose is false. a socially constructed mythology that doesn't hold up to reality. While today's tradwife content creators may look back on the 1950s with nostalgia, the truth is that many housewives of that era were deeply unhappy. Friedan advocated for women to engage in hobbies and careers outside the home so they could make use of their talents and intellect, and she noted that when women did so, they became much more satisfied with their lives. In subsequent decades, Friedan's book has been criticized for its narrow focus on white women who had enough economic privilege to stay home, when working-class women and women of color often faced more difficult struggles and were often engaged in careers outside the home due to necessity. However, Friedan's observation that social propaganda around womanhood differs sharply from the experiences of women as actual human beings rings true today. This essential message has lately become disturbingly relevant with the increase in propaganda across social media around so-called traditional gender roles. A new generation of tradwives on social media are pushing the idea that women should stay home as housewives. Once again, if you enjoy caring for children, cooking, and cleaning, that's great. Feminists are not trying to take that away from you. What feminists have fought for is the right for women to do other things as well, to have careers outside the home, to engage in hobbies, and to occupy a position of influence in public life. On the flip side of things, that also means giving men the freedom to do things that traditional gender roles have discouraged them from, like staying home with the kids if that's what they want to do. Ultimately, it means allowing people to be whoever they really are in their heart as a human, regardless of gender, and increasing individual liberty and freedom for everyone. Moving on to fiction, the best horror novel, and indeed one of the best novels overall that I read in 2024 was The Reformatory by Tanana Reeve Dew. This novel is set in 1950s Florida during the Jim Crow era. It's about a young black woman, Gloria, trying to free her 12-year-old brother, Robbie, from a reformatory school where he has been unjustly sent and basically imprisoned. The novel follows the perspectives of both Robbie as he navigates life inside the reformatory and Gloria, who resorts to increasingly desperate plans to get him out. Time is critical because the reformatory is a brutal place run by an evil warden, and many boys die suspicious deaths, never to return home. Robbie is in a great deal of danger. The school is a terrible place for anyone, especially black boys, but it's even worse for Robbie because he has the special talent of seeing ghosts or haints. There are a lot of haints at the reformatory. Since Robbie can communicate with him, they start to let him know that they have demands. They might be able to assist Robbie's escape, but only if he puts himself in danger to help them first. Robbie is thus faced with decisions that have life or death consequences. This novel is super well written and well researched. I became so emotionally invested in these characters that I had serious, almost physical anxiety while reading some of the most intense scenes. One note on the content, this novel does contain some graphic descriptions of violence and traumatic incidents motivated by racism, so be aware of that if you do decide to read it. Next, I really loved The Friend by Sigrid Nunez. This novel is about the friendship between two writers after one of them ended his own life. The story is narrated by a woman who knew him over many years, and she remained his friend even when he wasn't always the most outstanding human being. She ends up having to adopt his dog, a Great Dane, which I'm not a dog owner, but even I know that Great Danes' primary characteristic is they are huge. This ends up being kind of a problem, since our narrator lives in a tiny apartment in New York City that technically does not allow any dogs. As our narrator deals with the difficulty of caring for this dog, she meditates on her decades of friendship and on her grief. Because both of the friends were writers, she also reflects on the state of literature and writing as a profession, which, if you've somehow missed the news stories about writers being laid off, journalism being destroyed, cuts to university humanities departments, kids not knowing how to read books, etc., is generally not good. This narrative also wrestles with the reality that even though a lot of literature from the past has been recently deemed problematic, some of us still love it anyway. While all that sounds kind of depressing, the amazing thing about this novel is it's so beautifully written that you won't feel pained while reading it. Or maybe just a little pain. Next, I wanted to talk about Blasphemy by Douglas Preston. This is basically the complete opposite of Nunez's book. The Friend is an introspective elegy, and this one by Douglas Preston is a thriller with an outrageous yet totally believable plot. It's one of those books that will keep you staying up way too late as you race ahead to find out what happens next. In this novel, a group of elite scientists have built a particle accelerator in a mesa in the Arizona desert. Their leader is a brilliant iconoclast who has variously charmed and enraged the media due to his sometimes inspiring, sometimes rude, but always quotable comments. There's a lot of pressure on the scientists to make this particle accelerator succeed. The current US president, who is up for re-election, has invested billions into funding their research into the origins of the universe. His goal is to put the US on par with the most advanced physics research in other countries, but the particle accelerator's hefty price tag makes it a natural target for critics of government spending. Meanwhile, the construction and operation of the accelerator is controversial among local indigenous communities, many of whom have not seen the economic benefits they were promised for allowing access to their land. There's also a significant contingent of fundamentalist Christian influencers and legislators who believe the scientists' research into the Big Bang is an insult to God. Worst of all, during test runs, the scientists receive messages on their operating system from an unknown entity claiming to be God. Is it actually God or an unusually clever computer hacker? Throw a suspicious death into the mix and the whole volatile situation erupts into catastrophe. I've been reading several books by Douglas Preston lately, and I absolutely love his wild stories. His thrillers are some of the most creatively plotted novels I've ever read. If that's what you're into, definitely check him out. Finally, this memoir was the subject of a lot of online controversy early in 2024, and it is Molly by Blake Butler. Admittedly, I initially read the book because of the controversy, but I ended up finding it to be a really unique and meaningful book. One important content note, this memoir is about serious self-harm and contains graphic descriptions of that, so if you find that topic upsetting, I would recommend stopping this video and definitely not reading the book. In late 2023, Blake Butler, who is a writer, published this memoir about the death of his wife, Molly Brodak. Molly was a writer who had authored a memoir and a poetry collection, and in March 2020, she ended her own life. This memoir is basically Butler grappling with his grief and reminiscing about their relationship. Certain elements of the events Butler describes attracted a lot of attention because, when summarized succinctly, they may come across as rather salacious. In particular, he discovered, when looking through Molly's phone after her death to get pictures for the memorial service, that she had cheated on him with multiple people. There were photos and video clips of this on her phone as evidence, and since her passing was at least somewhat premeditated, as shown in certain excerpts from her journals that Butler included, it brings up the question of whether she planned for him to find this out or she just forgot to delete those things. On the day of her death, she also planned for Butler to find her body, and that is an event that he describes in great detail in the memoir. These aspects of the narrative created something of an internet feeding frenzy. The memoir was profiled in media outlets that often do review books, like The New Yorker and Vanity Fair, but it also attracted the attention of tabloid magazines that otherwise usually never really run stories about poets and writers. Various people on the internet criticized Butler for sharing his wife's secrets so publicly. Some went so far as to call the book a work of revenge porn and a cash grab. At the same time, the book received significant critical praise. So I was intrigued, I read it, and I absolutely loved it. In the way that you can love a book that is painful and difficult to read but clearly deserves your time and attention. Butler's style in this book could be described as unusually raw stream of consciousness. It's experimental, highly figurative, a bit wild, sometimes in ways that don't always work. One of the book's critics compared it to a super long drunk text. But overall, I thought it reflected his grief in a way that I found quite moving. When you're grieving, your thoughts aren't necessarily the most precise and clear. Sometimes this unusual style of writing led to transcendent moments where Butler was able to express fleeting emotions in ways that I found quite amazing. I read the book in electronic format on my phone, and I found myself taking screenshots of so many quotes. For example, talking about the period early in their relationship before they moved in together, he described the difficulty of living in a geographic location where both people might not be able to get the jobs in line with their career preferences. Life, by definition, had to hurt one way or another. Its unforeseen shadow looming large over the whole field like a permanent eclipse. One you have no choice but to keep encroaching forward under in the dark. In their early period of on-again, off-again dating, Molly and Blake met at a conference, and he describes how they walked around the conference ballroom, browsing the books and making jokes, more like old friends than messy lovers. In my memory of that day, I feel so much for her timid poise, her stunning laugh. How far away she seemed to loom inside herself there at my side. After her death, he gives us this image of their empty kitchen where they had spent so much time together, and I think this passage really well illustrates her interests, how she lived in their shared home, and her personality. Her closet full of dresses hung side by side in silent stillness, each aligned inside my mind with hours we'd spent, how she had moved, what she had said. Her row of aprons hung on hooks along the hallway from the kitchen, and her coats hung in the armoire, missing only the last one she'd been wearing. All these windows where she'd looked out, the muted sunlight shining gently against the pastel green and gold wallpaper she'd hung herself, affixed in me alone as memory of how proud she'd been to get it done, over the table where she'd sat so many hours in our last year, hunched over hand-painting cookies hours on end, the echo of her laughter somehow still hanging there among the stillness settled upon her tea kettle and her aprons and her plants. After her death, he describes his difficulty coping with the violent silence of the world, including the matted, jagged sunlight pouring in now through the windows, getting all over everything we'd ever had, nowhere to turn but toward the absence. And finally, to select one more quote, he describes disappointment as being like as if all we really are is just the shadow of what we're not. While both tabloids and more respectable magazines focused on the most clickbaity parts of the memoir, this was actually a fairly small part of the book, and I don't think Butler described the events in a vindictive manner. While he is obviously a central character in the story since it's told from his point of view, I thought it was apparent that he put significant effort into showing who Molly really was as a person, not idealizing her or imposing only his gaze on her, but illustrating her life in all its fullness, even when she made mistakes. It's clear that Butler respected her ambition and intelligence. He made lists of the art she loved and hated and how she said they made her feel. He described how she felt about nature, her buoyant moods, and also the moments where she was swallowed by despair, her professional aspirations, both as a poet and a baker. Ultimately, I thought it was a beautiful, nuanced, and moving portrait of a woman who was complicated, troubled, and brilliant, and that the memoir respected her by not trying to sanitize anything, while also paying tribute to her significant accomplishments. I enjoyed learning about her. Not only was she an accomplished writer, she was also an incredible baker and spent a large amount of time perfecting her own recipes. Her cakes were so impressive that she won a spot on the Great American Baking Show. I mean, this was an amazing woman, and I was glad Butler wrote about her because otherwise I probably wouldn't know who she was. Now I want to read the book she wrote, and I think Butler honored her legacy by making people want to do so. So those were among the best books I read in 2024. Did you read any wonderful books last year? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.